All right, we are live on YouTube. I know some of you were waiting already to join us. So if you are joining us on this live broadcast, feel free to interact in the chat. I'll be keeping an eye out for it as the conversation goes along. But this is kind of designed as a fishbowl. It's the second of four public conversations that we're doing. And I'm so glad that my guests have joined me today. They're going to introduce themselves in just a minute. If you missed the first conversation, it is in the live stream archives on our YouTube channel. So if you're joining us, you probably already know that the Hymn Society has a YouTube channel, and you can just poke around. And last month, we had a live broadcast with Deborah Carlton Loftus and Michael Hahn on kind of the history of who chose congregational song, how were collections put together, when were they put together, when did that become a thing, and kind of the progression of all of that. And that led us up to about the mid 1900s, when sometimes people will refer to that time as the hymnal explosion, when there were just collections just flying out of everywhere, and just so many options. And by the mid 20th century, the idea of denominational hymn books was very much ingrained in the ethos of most mainline Protestants. Roman Catholics were producing a lot more hymnals and things because of the Second Vatican Council, and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, we need hymnals with English, songs in English and things like that. And so who we have today, we're going to move into a conversation centered around kind of current hymnals, things that you would very likely see in the pews in congregations across the US and Canada. And these are the editors of those collections. Most of the time, collections will have a team of people that help put these hymnals and other collections together. But somebody has to wrangle all those people, and somebody has to do a lot of the heavy lifting of some decision making, and then just really leading the way. And so that's who we have before us today. So I'm going to have each one of them introduce themselves, and just kind of give us an idea of what hymnal or hymnals are you connected to that are currently in people's pews, and how did you end up being the editor of those collections? What brought you? What part of your journey landed you at that point? So I'm going to ask Maria Corneau to go first.
Hello, everyone. I'm Maria Eugenia Corneau, originally from Buenos Aires, Argentina, living in Miami, Florida, and working full-time in Michigan, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, at the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. I'm a program manager there, an associate director, and I'm really the less expected hymnal editor ever because I am not a musician. So my journey is very unique, and it's thanks to being part of the wonderful team at CICW that I have been able to take this role. So I am I'm fluent in, of course, in Spanish. That's my first language, and our hymnal, Santo, 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 Holy, 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 is a fully bilingual hymnal. That explains a little bit why I am there. Also, in my PhD dissertation, I studied the formative power of song as part of my dissertation. I explored how, in fact, how worship shaped identity, Protestant identity in the early times in Argentina, exploring the three denominations that started worshiping in Spanish. So as part of my research, I explored the hymnals, the earliest hymnals published in my country, and how the songs and the spiritual diet of these hymnals really shaped and formed a particular way of being Christians in a context where Catholicism was so dominant. So I had this background, my work at CICW and my personal journey as a researcher. And then we had this wonderful God-led conversation with GIA Bob Battistini. GIA had recently published We Pray in Song, and a bilingual hymnal for especially for Catholic parishes and congregations. And he asked us if we would be interested in developing something for the Protestant side. Basically, the idea originally was just trimming things that could be like generate some tension or not appropriate for Protestant context. And that was the original conversation. And then the project unfolded in a very different way. And our director, John Whitfleet, was very enthusiastic about taking this project because we are, as part of our mission, we produce resources for worshiping communities. And so our main idea was to produce this resource as an ecumenical resource and fully bilingual, and aim to bring tradition, but also new content. And it really was a work of a team. And I was co-managing editor, working primarily with texts. And really my work was possible and by the blessing of working with my colleague Becky Snipa. She took all the musical side, and really we worked so well together, and she's very gifted. And that was part of the beauty of the project. It was all the collaborative environment that allowed us to produce this resource after 5 years of work.
Well, that's really interesting. Just thinking about having co-editors, one that is more musically focused and one that's text focused, because I mean, historically, most hymnals would have been text only until the last 100 or so years, when music and words together became the more standard way of doing things. So that I just throwing that out there is something that you already made me think about. So thank you. Bradley is next.
Thanks, Brian. Bradley Kaufman. I am joining this call from my home in Goshen, Indiana. I, from 2016 to 2020, had the privilege and responsibility of being the project director and general editor for Voices Together, a new denominational hymnal for Mennonites, members of Mennonite Church Canada and Mennonite Church USA. So the publisher for whom I worked is Menno Media, and they serve both of those denominations. And so I had the joy of embedding with an extraordinary team. Thanks for the visual. Embedding with an extraordinary team of church-loving experts across the U.S. and Canada, and so that's what brings me to the table today. My journey to becoming a hymnal editor was that I think that the predecessor to Voices Together was Hymnal, a worship book, a book with a practical title, published in 1992, and that was the year that I turned 18 and started college. And so I moved from my home in rural Ohio to Goshen College, and it's a Mennonite school. And here on campus was Mary Oyer, a fellow of the Hymn Society, venerated hymnologist, musicologist, and she had been co-leader of this project through a good portion of the work. She did not see it through to completion, but nonetheless, she was here as a champion of that work and helping students and grown-ups from all walks of life, helping people find ways into that brand new hymnal. And so having that introduction to someone who so masterfully helped a congregation find a way into a song and understand the meaning and relationships that underpin whatever arrives at the page, that was extremely formative for me. And Ken Nafziger was another person who came to campus a couple of times in those years to celebrate and launch Hymnal Worship Book. So that was had a big impact on me as a young growing professional. I completed a degree in music education and taught for 20 years. And so I did that in the intervening time. And then in 2016, when I was between opportunities and kind of pondering what was next, the schedule of this project mapped on remarkably well to an opening that I had to do something a little bit different. And so I was really fortunate to be able to come to that work in the way that I did.
Thanks. Anytime Ken Knapsinger is mentioned, it just brings a smile to my face because he's such a dear soul and wonderful leader. Oh my gosh. Kate, you're next.
I'm Kate Williams. This is my dog Nova. Hopefully no one's allergic, so it won't be a problem in this call. I work for GIA Publications, and the most recent completed hymnal that I would be associated with would be Gather, 4th edition, which is a Catholic hymnal that obviously is in its 4th iteration. So it's been around for a few decades now. Previously to my work at GIA, I was a music director in the Archdiocese of Chicago. GIA is kind of based out of Chicago. I've been in Chicago for a long while. I came here for college, actually. I studied music composition at DePaul University, and then I worked in the Archdiocese at a number of different parishes as music director. Prior to Chicago and in Chicago, my context has always been a multicultural, multilingual community, specifically English and Spanish speaking. And so I've had a lot of wonderful experiences, both in rural America, where I was coming from, and in urban America, where I began my ministry after my college years. I did my graduate work at Catholic Theological Union on the south side of Chicago. And kind of towards the end of that, I was feeling like a pull from parish ministry into something a bit more. And so a position opened at GIA. That's how I landed there in 2016. And by 2020, we knew that it was time to think about the next iteration of the Gather hymnal. Whether it's Gather or Worship, those are kind of our flagship hymnals at GIA. Most of our hymnals are geared towards a Catholic audience, but of course we have lots of other denominational hymnals who are part of our work too, including we were very proud to partner with both Maria and Bradley on various aspects of those hymnal projects. So in 2020, the best year, as all of us remember, to release a hymnal. We released Gather 4th edition, and now we've been seeing over the past few years that kind of flood the pews all across the nation. It's been a wonderful experience that I'm sure we're going to talk more about very soon.
Thanks. And I was wondering why I was getting all stuffed up and stuff, and it's because
Yeah, sorry about that.
yeah, thanks for the warning. So David, you're last but certainly not least.
Hello, everybody. I'm David Eicher, and I am currently in Silver City, New Mexico, where we moved upon retirement right in 2020 in the height of COVID. We made the move. So, yeah, my journey to I would suspect, like many of us, being a hymnal editor was not really in my plan. I never kind of thought that was something that I would be doing, but I knew that the music of the church was probably always going to be a center point of my life. My father was a pastor in the Anabaptist tradition in the Church of the Brethren, and so I grew up in a singing tradition and four-part singing tradition, although we were accompanied more than our Mennonite brothers and sisters did. But my father had studied voice in college, not just as a side. My mother loved to sing. And so I grew up in that singing, kind of a singing household. And I always have to kind of say that one of the formative things for me was as a child, we spent many an hour in the car going places. My father and mother loved to travel. My dad was always going to see people in his church. And so we were always in the car. And when we kids, my sister and I, would start to go, I'm bored, the usual child thing, my parents would start singing hymns and we would all sing. And it was almost a game of how many of the verses could we get through in 4 parts without looking at a hymnal or looking at the text. And so yeah, that's kind of, the hymns were there always for me. And in the Church of the Brethren, it was quite a mix of traditional European hymns and then certainly lots out of the gospel revival traditions here in the U.S. Um, so anyway, that was there. I went to college not expecting to do music because I wanted to make money. Um, and so I was going into the sciences, pre-med, pre-pharmacy, medical technology. Spring term junior year, I switched to a music major. So it took me that long to kind of just give in to what was my primary call, I think, all along. So I graduated with a degree in music and organ, and I went on to graduate school at Valparaiso University, Lutheran school, and that's when I got introduced to liturgy. Up till that point, it was Church of the Brethren was very sort of non-liturgical. Um, my father wanted to bring in an Advent wreath one time and just about got thrown out of the church for bringing in this Catholic tradition. It was just one of those things. But I fell in love with liturgy at Valparaiso. My first job out of college was in a Lutheran church. Then I went to a Presbyterian church, switched my membership there, and became very active in Presbyterian music circles through the Presbyterian Association of Musicians, and also got introduced to the Hymn Society by a brochure arriving in the mail at the church. For my first conference, I think was Atlanta, was it 1980 or 81, one of those years, and I was hooked immediately. I served the Hymn Society in various roles as officer, and yeah, and life just continued on. And then my job at a church where I'd been for almost 30 years ended. And so I was sort of flopping around looking for something to do. And I'm not sure exactly how my name got to Presbyterian Publishing Corporation, but they asked me to apply to be editor for a new hymnal project. And I said, no, no, thanks, not interested. Might as well paint a target on my back, to do that kind of work. And I think I'll just freelance accompanying choirs various places and never mind. And they kind of kept pushing me to apply. And I finally decided, well, if I truly believe in that God's call often appears through other people, that I ought to at least talk to him about it before I say no. And so I interviewed as well as did other people for the job, and they offered it to me. So I worked from 2008 to 2014 on Glory to God, the Presbyterian hymnal that was published in 2013. And it was I say to people, I've never worked harder and I've never enjoyed my work more. It was a great time, but it was once in a lifetime.
Unless you're Sam Young.
Well, yes. I mean, yeah, nobody wants
Just
to be
twice in a lifetime.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, or Kate. That's right. If you work for a publisher, I mean, that's on you, Kate. You. Well, thank you all. Thank you all for being here, and what interesting ways to find yourselves as an editor of a hymnal. So my next question is something we can chew on is, and I think people will be interested in this, is how do you have 800 or so hymns. I'm just pulling up I think this is Glory to God, and they've got 853. That's pretty standard number of hymns. What was your process for your committees? I mean, you don't have to get into the nitty gritty, but what was the process of choosing the top 836 hymns or however many? I mean, did you start by just everyone naming their favorites? Did you start with the previous hymnal? I mean, for instance, in Gather 4, I assume you started with Gather 3. And the Presbyterians, you would have had a predecessor hymnal. I guess the 1990 Presbyterian hymnal would have been the one I grew up with. And then Bradley, you showed yours. Although Maria, I think yours may be a very different type of story as far as this is concerned, because there really wouldn't have been much of a predecessor for a fully bilingual hymnal. So, describe to me what your process was like. Did you have full control? Did you get to decide all 836? Wouldn't that be nice? Bradley says no. Well, say more about that, Bradley. Why don't you start, since you had a visceral reaction to my joke comment?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, I was reacting to the comment that it'd be nice to choose them all on one's own. There are several ways into this question, and when we gathered for our first meeting in September of 2016, I had given the committee, who didn't all know each other yet. We were getting ready to meet in person for the first time. Our group met 3 times a year in person. Did a lot of Zoom calls, of course, and other kinds of collaboration. But as we prepared to meet for the first time, I gave the intentionally confounding, I guess, assignment that each person make a list of their 100 essential songs from Hymnal Worship Book, the volume we were looking to succeed with this project. And so, I got flooded with clarifying questions like, is this 100 things that get me through the church here? Or is this 100 of just the things that are closest to my heart? Is this 100 things that I think serves my community? 100 things that serves more broadly than that? And so it surfaced a lot of the important questions that would guide us throughout the process. And born out of some of that frustration of just having to reckon with, like, okay, what are the considerations we have to hold here as we proceed? And so then the streams of content that we considered, that we screened, reviewed, evaluated, were, of course, the 1992 hymnal. By the time we began our work, there were 2 supplements that were 9 and 11 years old, supplements to that volume. And so one of our early decisions was, like, are we drawing material from those supplements, or are we letting those stand alone and only considering work outside of those things? We opted in the first meeting to draw content from those supplements, because there had been a brilliant process of testing that material, and there was clear content that rose to the top and was part of the denominational canon. So those recent collections, other recent hymnals, the 3 hymnals produced in 2013, David's Glory to God and Lift Up Your Hearts, and Community of Christ Sings, those were only 3 years old, and so we were poring over those with a lot of interest. Single author collections of the sort that Kate and GIA publish, there was hundreds of those kinds of things that we screened. The CCLI Top 100, the 1992 hymnal that we were succeeding, tested the waters with a couple of contemporary worship songs, just literally just 2 or 3. We knew that we were ready to step more deeply into the world of CCLI and contemporary worship music. We had people on the committee with that expertise, and we were open to a lot of learning about that body of work. And so that guided our process. We had an open submissions period where we welcomed content from anyone who wanted to send it to us. We decided to have that open for 1 year. And so we made a web portal and received approximately 2,300 submissions in that year's time. Half of those were from Mennonite or Anabaptist sources, and half of them were ecumenical.
That is way more than I thought you were going to say.
Yeah. Yeah, 2,300,
lot.
which included works of visual art, because we had made the decision fairly early on.
Oh,
We're going
yeah.
to include works of visual art in this as well. So that was the open submissions process. We also knew I think one of the innovations that Hymnal Worship Book offered in 1992 was the inclusion of more world music and global song. And that had really enriched worship in Canadian Mennonite and US Mennonite spaces. There's a certain kind of that global song that mapped onto the sort of denominational ethos of congregational song. And we, in our process, we said we want to learn what immigrant groups who are parts of our denominations in North America, immigrant groups who are here, what are they singing in worship? Because often it wasn't the traditional Kenyan song. It wasn't the song that comes out of folk traditions. And those had been kind of our go-tos in those spaces. And we said, well, what would it be to really intentionally worship with immigrant groups who are here? What are they singing? What's animating worship for them? And so a grant through the Calvin Institute, Christian Worship.
Keep coming up.
Yeah. Really allowed us to take that question seriously and do some traveling and research. And so that was a thing that really became important to us in the process as well. I think I've identified most of the streams that we were.
That's really great, and it does kind of confirm. I mean, I would assume if you had a predecessor hymnal that you're succeeding or following, it's a good place to start. So Maria, I imagine that's not how you started. What was your process like?
Well, in fact, yes, we had the predecessor that is
You did.
Oramos
the
cantando,
Catholic
we
one.
pray in song.
So okay.
That was, but then things became more complicated. We say, well, that's an easy project, a couple of months, dreaming a little bit, and then it became something different as we started involving different kind of people. And also it's a very unique resource because we are not developing a hymnal for a denomination. We wanted this to be an ecumenical resource and not necessarily for congregations that worship every single Sunday bilingually, some of them, but in the Protestant world, there are fewer than on the Catholic side, I would say. But also we wanted the resource to build bridges, to be a resource for an English-speaking congregation who is hosting or renting the space for a Spanish-speaking congregation, or seminary or university chapels. And so as we were expanding the users and trying to make this resource friendly or useful for a broader audience, is where things became more complicated. We are starting involving more people. And thanks God we had the resources to do this, not in a way that is market driven, but really we had the resources to make this as useful as possible in our vision. So we had several consultations and different processes of also surveys, but everyone in their own denomination and tradition was somehow relying on the hymnals they loved and knew. So there are many, like a network really of hymnals. Some the Methodist proposed hymnals that they loved from their hymnal hymn books, the Methodist hymn books, and the same with the Presbyterians, the same with the Baptists. So at the end of the day, we had a lot of material, but then we had to decide, well, yes, this is about what people know and love, but also we want to add new things. And this is when we are starting, and like, I think it was more towards the second half of the project, to commission some songs and to identify new songs for particular topics or sections of the hymnal where we felt this need. Also, we wanted to balance songs composed originally in English with songs composed in Spanish. So to keep that balance, also we needed to look for new resources or to invest more in researching hymnals published in Spanish language in Latin America or Spain. So it would mean there are many layers and complexities, and it was really a very a fascinating project, a lot of learning, and a very excited one.
Well, that's really interesting, Maria. And I think Bradley, you were approaching this idea as well, and Maria just kind of named it that. Yes, you're choosing things that people love and use currently. I mean, that's an important part of the process for sure. Partly because you want it to be useful to people, and you want people to think like, oh yeah, I can use this because it has my top 10 favorites. But on the other hand, you do want to kind of push to new places. You want to expand the repertoire. You want to allow for these a little bit of risk taking to say, oh, maybe God will do something with this song, or maybe this will hit home and people just don't know about it. And so, and Kate, you mentioned, you just did Gather 4. So, which is kind of like, well, if Gather 1 worked, why have Gather 2? And if Gather 2 worked, why have Gather 3? So maybe, Kate, you could kind of address that part of the process is why have these new hymnals, and when you do, what's the thought process behind introducing those things that are pushing to new places?
Sure. Thanks for asking. I think the maybe theologically astute answer to the question is that we know that God is still speaking to us and God is still working. And one of the ways that we experience God's working through us is through the gift of song. I think anybody who's probably watching this webinar now or in the days to come would agree with that. That's why we do this. We found God here. We found something good here. And God's not done with us yet. God's got more to say. So new songs are being written all the time. And the best way to, kind of help those songs have a full and fruitful life is to enshrine them in a permanent resource that will stay in the pews or in people's hands for a longer duration of time. So that's the work essentially that we're talking about here, is hymnal creation. So it's a collection of the songs that we believe are representative of our understanding of how God is living and moving, speaking among us now. Of course, especially from a Catholic tradition, that carries with it a really faithful and earnest and intentional carrying forward of tradition and legacy. A traditional legacy that for us goes all the way back to chant. So I don't think you'll find a hymnal at GIA that doesn't include some chant resources or aspects of chant. Sometimes those chants are reimagined in a new way with accompaniment or harmony or meter, but you'll also see them just in their plain form as well. And I would say even before we begin to think about what the next edition of a hymnal will look like, it's really important to us. And one of the things that I'm really proud of actually is that obviously GIA is a business. So I have a business investment in this, but I also have a very personal investment as a lifelong Catholic. It's important to me when it comes to Gather 4 or hymnals that are geared towards a Catholic audience. It's important to me what my people are holding in their hands and the words that they're putting on their mouths, because we're supposed to be in this together, right? There's lots of room for interpretation already. Let's give us, a good unified starting place as much as we can. And so I'm proud that our company is willing to make a huge upfront investment. Like, it is true, we have all the resources in our hands right now. We could like an AI bot, just choose the songs that are reported the most frequently for one license, or choose the songs that have sold the greatest in the last 30 years. We could just turn it out like that. But I'm proud to be a part of a mission that agrees that, like, this is not simply it's not simply mathematical in science. There's a human element here that simply must be honored if we're trying to be faithful to our understanding of that gift of dialogue with God. And so our investment up front includes bringing together a committee of people that is representative of Catholic expression across the country. So we made sure we literally had somebody from each coast and lots of places in between, people who are coming from environments of a lot of um, working with a lot of young people at a time, like college campuses, or involved in a lot of youth ministry in their parish. But we also want to have good representation of, a cathedral style worship, which is oftentimes referred to, language that will include organ-based literature and a lot of choral work incorporated into congregational song. And so, you got to start off feeling like you can't possibly represent everyone's preferences, but do you have a good, chunk there that could be representative of a type of Catholic expression? And so we brought together 6 people from across the country to do that. And in some ways, yeah, we did look at Gather 3. And the timing of Gather 3 is important because Gather 3rd edition came out the same time Worship 4 came out, and that was, because of a particular need. In 2010, 2011, the Catholics received the 3rd edition of the Roman Missal, and so a lot of our congregational responses, our words, our parts, the words changed, and so all of our hymnals were erroneous. And
The
so
Lord be with you and with your spirit.
we can't even agree on that on this call, can we? And so people needed something kind of swiftly. Like, I would say that book came together more swiftly than our other hymnal projects would, based
Sure.
on a need. And so we did start off looking at Gather 3, sure, because a lot of people invested in that resource, and it now had 10 years of people learning about the things in that hymnal and, adopting them and growing into them with their communities. And so it was important to start with that resource. We also had the benefit of 10 years of knowing which things that were written in those, in that time that it came up, which things rose to the top. In particular, which mass settings kind of rose to the top, which mass settings are being most frequently used. Because we want to make sure that if we think of hymnals as real estate, we want to make sure that we are dividing the real estate appropriately based on what people need at their at the ready in their hands, and where people are ready to push and grow and learn a little bit. And so that was the work of the committee.
And when you talk about, congregational song in a Roman Catholic context, mass settings is a huge deal, right? This,
That's right. It's kind of like, if you sing nothing else, you should sing those responses,
exactly.
those
That's like kind of
dialogues.
the starter pack of
Yeah.
Roman Catholic congregational song is your mass settings. So, yeah, that would be a huge deal in choosing. A question came in while you were talking, Kate, and I'm gonna punt this to Dave, just to keep you on your toes. So the Friends of National City Christian Church, which I assume is the YouTube account for National City Christian, which is where the hymn study is headquartered. So I'm not sure who's using that account, but whoever asked this says, following up on Kate's comment about a permanent resource, because you're talking about that kind of long-term investment that a hymnal is. How do you respond to those that say that the age of the hymnal is past, that digital media has changed the landscape? Because when I think about, Dave, when I think about Glory to God, that was right. I think for me, that's right when that conversation really started happening more often, where it's like, should we do a new hymnal? What does that even look like in the digital age? I wonder if you dealt with that.
Absolutely. It was kind of one of the first big things we started to struggle with was, is there even the point in doing a printed resource. And so one of the things that we did right after I moved to Louisville and started the work at the publishing house was at that time in the Presbyterian Church USA denominational structures, there was a unit called Research Services, and they actually were professionally trained research people who would undertake research projects for any group within the church. So if you wanted to know something, you could go to Research Services and say, here's what we really need to know. Can you design a statistically accurate survey that would help us figure this out? This is, I think, a very typical Presbyterian response, right? I mean, you want to figure it out and use your head. So we went to them and we said, we want to do a couple of research projects. And one of them is, we want to know what's being used in the 1990 hymnal the most. We want that. Secondly, we want to know where are people getting what are they using as their resource for congregational song? Is it the denominational hymnal? Is it CCLI? Is it some other online source? Is it local people in their congregation writing songs for them to sing? Where do they get the preponderance of the resources for congregational song? And we included in that any liturgically sung pieces as well as sort of standard hymns or congregational song. And at that point, so we're now talking 2008, 2009 was when that research project was completed. The biggest majority of folks were still using the Presbyterian denominational hymnal as their main resource, as a printed resource. One of the other things we asked at that time was, how much are you using projection versus printed resource? Because that was the other thing. Are we going to put out a projection edition, or how is that, and what would that look like? And so again, there were a few more churches who were using projection, but they were still getting their resources out of denominational sources. So we decided to move ahead with the printed resource, but we also did develop a fully projection edition. And at my insistence, that was available on the same flash drive in 2 different versions. One included at least the melody line for everything along with the texts. And then there was a second thing, you could just project texts if you wanted to do that. So that's kind of where we came with that. But those research projects, I would say, formed the foundation and the basis for much of our decision making. As we started with what we called the no-brainer list. We went through the 1990 hymnal at number 1. Everybody had the book in front of them at the first meeting, and we went number 1. And if we heard a single no or a nah, that wasn't a no-brainer, right? It needed to be, everybody on the committee would say, we absolutely have to have Silent Night in the hymnal. Yeah, I mean, those kinds of things. And then we went back to all the others, and we talked about each one in particular. Should we carry this forward? We looked at the research. How much is it being used? And if it's not being used very much, do we as a committee still feel like, well, it needs to be there, however? Like, for instance, I think for us, the big thing was metrical psalmody. For Presbyterian, psalms were always the primary thing, but they had fallen out of use. And so some of those we said, we need to leave those in there because that is who we are as a denomination. So those were the way of decision, but very often it would be, well, how many people are using that? And we'd pull out the research and look at what the research said, and that would inform our decision. We weren't slaves to it. We did decide that it would be a committee decision, yes or no, but that certainly entered into our discussion. And we decided also that this was something I wanted right from the beginning, was that anything that was voted to go into the hymnal had to have at least 2/3 of the people on the committee saying yes, it had to go in. I didn't want just a simple majority. for that, I wanted it to be obvious that a large number, a 2/3 majority at least of that group said yes, it needed to go in there. So that was kind of how we dealt with all of that. But certainly that the question of print versus digital versus, was a big part of the discussion. So yeah, and it was that argument of needing something permanent, we felt like, in people's hands. Yeah.
Yeah.
We just, like, we used the thing, you might sing hymn number 213. Your pastor, your congregation might never sing number 214. That might be, though, one of your favorites. And the fact that it's there in your book, and when you sing 213, you see it, seemed to us to be an important enough reason to put something in.
Well, so that's a great, it's almost like I asked you to segue us into our next the next kind of topic or question is so you've put together these hymnals. You've made difficult choices about what do we carry forward out of previous collections, predecessors. What new things do you add in? How do you figure out how to do that? I mean, all of the very difficult, lengthy processes, unless you're doing worship 3 on a short time frame. But still intense. And then you send the hymnal out into the world, right? The publisher, prints it off and they sell the hymnal and it gets in the pews of God knows how many different churches. And what has been your experience of how your hymnals, or the hymnals that you helped, not your hymnals, they're not yours, the hymnals that you helped to edit and curate and send out into the world, what's been your experience of how people have been using them, and how was it received? Were there times where you felt like this really is shaping people's faith in a way that I hoped and dreamed about? Or were there things that happened where you thought, well, that missed the mark? Or, like, what's been your experience? That has to be a little bit of heart-wrenching experience because you put so much of your time and effort towards these things. That's open to anyone.
I can start just because I think I have a pretty significant answer to that question. I think everybody would agree, it's just an absolute joy to see the book in pews all across the country. It's riveting. It's I don't know. It's one of the greatest privileges of my life for sure. I think one of the significant things about Gather Fourth Edition that made me feel like this is shaping something. This is a big deal. We always talk about hymnals as a snapshot in time. They're how we see ourselves now. They're telling a story about who we are now, telling a story about how we are wrestling with God in this moment and how we're praising God in this moment. And to release a hymnal in 2020 meant that we needed to say some pretty particular things. One of those things, of course, we had lots of conversations about representation and the effects of good modeling of representation in the liturgy, the effects of a lack of representation in the liturgy. But also we needed to make a pretty significant decision to not include works by known abusive composers. And for Catholics, that meant that there's a significant number of songs that were well known that, I see a question in the chat here about the canon that we, as the copyright holder, elected to remove from what some people might have considered the canon in favor of supporting people who had been harmed by that person or by the opportunities that were created by promoting that person's work. And so, I still see it, and I'll be honest with you, I think this probably is going to be a part of the rest of my life's work is, supporting my own perspective of that decision, supporting the survivors of that decision, and watching these endless threads go on about, people's own opinions or heartbreaks surrounding that decision, what they would have done, how they think, we should have handled it, or blah, blah, blah. And in the moment, those things can be quite painful, but in the big scheme of things, I think it is doing something and saying something again about who we are, what this snapshot in time means for us, what we're willing to wrestle with for the sake of what we believe is good or a step in the right direction. And so when I'm not busy being wounded by that, I can be very, very proud of being a part of this part of history that is, you know, that I'll be very proud to share with my daughter someday, that, you know, this is what we decided in that moment for these reasons, no matter how hard we thought it might be.
I'd like to say, I don't have a specific sort of instance to report, but one of the things the committee really dreamed about was our hymnal Glory to God being some kind of perhaps a bridge building tool in congregations that had multiple worship services divided by musical style most often. And so when we got back stories of people saying, wow, both the 9 o'clock and the 11 o'clock service are using this hymnal, right? And then when we do our once a quarter joint service where everybody like begrudgingly puts up with, well, we have to sing your songs and you have to sing our songs, we went, wow, we're singing some of the same songs in both services. Maybe the first service is being accompanied by a more praise band kind of instrumentation, and the second service is with a keyboard perhaps, but it's the same song. And so for me, that was when I went, okay, all this stress about whether we print contemporary music or whether people are getting that from other places, we don't need to print it. It was the representation issue for us, that it's in the book, whether the contemporary service folks use it the way it's printed in the book or not, it's there. And the folks at the organ only service see it and know that it's there. And there is that issue of representation to say we don't all sing exactly the same way, but we are all part of the same church.
I would say the same as David. Bridge building is part of the result of this resource, as David mentioned, because we tried to find songs where everyone could feel comfortable and everyone will be stretched. And it's a decision of the congregations to what extent they are stretching or not, but everyone finds something familiar. But also the build bridging between language communities, resisting the cultural forces towards homogenization and assimilation, respecting cultural diversity, and also helping the immigrant church with the 1.5 and 2.0 generation. So welcoming and build bridging.
I resonate with all that's been shared and appreciate the shared experience of this group so much. And Kate has mentioned a couple of things that really were parallel experiences for us. So we published in 2020 and could not have foreseen the pandemic. And that was a devastating grief that we experienced in the book started arriving in November of 2020 due to supply chain delays and other factors, and we couldn't gather. It was pre-vaccine. It was so many stark realities, and so that the investment that we had made in making a projection edition, which Dave spoke of also, ended up being clutch. I mean, it was the thing that allowed people to engage this work that we had done, and so we got a lot of immediate feedback, like it's just like what a gift that was, because it was a new resource. It was previous collections had not included that kind of that kind of resource. And so, supporting Zoom worship from the launch of the project was really important. There are a couple other things I would say, and Kate too. I'm glad that you brought up survivor-centered response in the work of 2019 and 2020. That was a moment that, in parallel to what you were describing, Kate, we were invested in and making those decisions as well. And there were beloved songs that we chose not to include, and also took time to learn from experts, what does a survivor-centered response look like, and creating resources that we could pass on to congregations and say, here's a way of navigating this conversation in your local context. And so providing some of those tools was really important to us. When I think about responses from pastors and church musicians, the reception of the collection, most of what I hear is deep gratitude, surprise. Like, people are surprised by the kinds of resources that were offered. One of the things that came into focus for me throughout this work is that different generations articulate their pastoral care needs in different ways with different insights and new. I remember in '99 what a singing Marty Haugen's healer of our every ill. Like, we didn't have anything that had this expansive kind of healing that you could reach for in lots of different moments of crisis or need. And so likewise in 2020, there were new ways of talking about mental health, new ways of talking about caring for the planet, all these things, and people really responded to those things. There are two bits of feedback that I received early on that were especially impactful to me. One was someone stopped me at a public event here and said, my 90-something-year-old father, a retired Mennonite pastor, uses Voices Together as a devotional device, as a devotional focus every day. And in COVID, that was a lot of what people did. And she said, "Do you want to know his favorite song?" And I said, "Absolutely, I do." And she said, it was David Bjorland's "Ask the Complicated Questions. Do not fear to be
Nice.
found." And as a nonagenarian, that was a real gift. And there have been moments when elders have pointed the way to how to digest and receive a new collection in ways that I've appreciated. My friend Anita Stolzfus-Breckbill sent me a photograph of her father's Voices Together copy just last year, and her father Ed was on the 1969 hymnal committee for Mennonites. And she sent me a photo of his bedside copy of Voices Together, and it was in tatters, and in 2024, 4 years in. And so those kinds of things, he uses it so regularly that it looks like a 20-year-old book at this point. But those are the things that bring a lot of impact and gratitude.
It's really good to hear, because people can be brutal sometimes. So it's so nice. It's so nice to hear that. I mean, after hearing about, and I know because I've known so many of you for so long and followed the works of these committees and stuff, how hard you work and how faithfully you work. That there are these stories and these experiences where you do feel that sense of gratitude. As I was thinking about gratitude, just in case you're watching this and you're not really familiar with how to use a hymnal, usually, a lot of hymnals are, you got your before Christ, like waiting for Christ, Advent-y things, and then Christmas section. And it kind of follows the church year, or you'll have like a big topical thing where you've got communion hymns and different stuff like that. But then at the back, a lot of times there's this index by topic or by scripture, sometimes both. So if you're like, you know what, these three hymns that are in this section called Thanksgiving aren't hitting the mark, you can go back and there's an index where then Thanksgiving hymns, there's like 20 more suggestions from the hymnal that have to do with Thanksgiving or healing or whatever you're searching for. And I'm paid to know hymns because I work for the Hymn Society, right? Like I'm paid to know a lot of stuff about this. But when I'm choosing songs for my local church, I open this index all the time, right? Because I'm like, I don't know, I just can't think of like what's going to be the right fit. And so just a very practical question. Other than just expressing gratitude for those indexes, how do you put those together? Like, what in the world? How do you even? That's a lot of work, right? Who does that?
You hope you have some folks that you know that have that kind of a brain, right? That
Yeah.
automatically insert things into categories and have deep scriptural knowledge so that they can assign things to various topics. It's certainly that's what we did. We called upon other folks for whom indexing is their life. To kind of help put that together. Because, yeah, for one thing, we just didn't have the time to deal with that. We were dealing with all the other issues like copyrights and layouts and everything else.
That sounds like an AA kind of group, like when indexing is your life, hi, I'm Brian and I index things all the
And
time.
I index my grocery list or whatever. Yeah.
Well, that's great. So a lot of that is outsourced to folks who really live and breathe that kind of work. I can see that. It's, in the chat, just an aside, Hannah Brown says, I'm grateful for your work on this issue, Kate, and you've helped to shift the practices on that whole issue. Frank Fortunato says it was quite daring that Voices Together included chord charts for almost every song, a huge help for worship teams to have that addition to almost the entire hymnal. So just once again, gratitude being shown for all of this work. We've reached the hour point, and I want to respect all your time. So gratitude for what you've done, for producing these collections that are indeed, I mean, just shaping people's faith and expressing their thanks to God and their journey and wrestling with God and where we are. And admonition for those watching this to continue advocating for groups like this to keep thinking deeply about what the church is singing, researching things so that we know what is meaningful to congregations. That takes a lot of work and money for someone to really do that research and spend that time. And then for these groups to then kind of take these risks, thoughtful and theologically beautiful risks, to say maybe the church should be singing this now. So keep advocating for these types of groups to be supported. Because I know on the local level, this has been, I mean, all of these hymnals have been so helpful for me. Week after week, I have to choose these songs. It's so helpful. So join us for the next conversation, which is going to be about a month from now. Let me pull up my calendar so that I can tell you exactly when it will be. It's right. It's before Holy Week, right? So I didn't want to get all close to Holy Week, too close to Holy Week. So it's Monday, April 7th at 2 p.m. Eastern, so same time. And we'll publicize the link. It'll be live on YouTube, where I'm going to invite some church musicians and pastors and people that are doing this week to week choosing of congregational song to say, like, all right, how's it going? What do you do? What resources are you using? And what's that process like? What do you wish would happen in the future to be even more helpful? So this conversation will continue. Dave, Maria, Bradley, Kate, thank you so much for being here. And this was a great conversation. It's always great to talk with each one of you. So thanks for being here.
Thank Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Brian.
All right. And take care,
Thanks for
everybody.
having us.